Hi, everybody. We're going to start in Luke 24. We'll be there just for a few minutes, and then we'll head over to Psalm 16. We'll start in Luke 24. On the very first Easter Sunday morning, when Jesus rose from the dead, no one has yet been able to make sense of the empty tomb. All the gospel accounts tell us that as they discover this empty tomb, there's not necessarily rejoicing, there's just confusion. They don't know what to do with it. This group of women have discovered that Jesus is gone, the tomb is empty. They report it back to the disciples. Luke chapter 24, verse 10. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles, that the tomb was empty. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. So they don't know what to think of this. Is this weird gossip? Is this something that's made up? This can't be the case. They go and they verify it. But then the Bible records for us this very interesting aside event that takes place. Two of those disciples are on their way to the city of Emmaus. As they're walking along, the risen Jesus walks with them. They can't tell that it's him, and they have this conversation as they're walking along. So chapter 24, starting in verse 13, let's just read the account. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, 'O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself.'" What an interesting account. They don't know it's him. We don't know why they don't know it's him. Jesus hides his identity from them, and they have this conversation. They're extremely discouraged and disappointed. We had hoped. Those are the words of discouragement. We had hoped that he was the promised one to redeem Israel, but he's gone, and we don't know where he's at. And Jesus then opens their eyes by preaching to them a sermon. Verse 27, beginning with Moses, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament were written by Moses, Genesis to Deuteronomy, and all the prophets. He interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So he opens up their eyes to the entire Old Testament. That's the scriptures at this point. New Testament's not written yet. So he helps them to see this entire Old Testament that your entire faith is based on. All of it was pointing to me. Wouldn't you have loved to hear that sermon? I would have loved to have heard what texts he used. Where did he go to prove this? What were the ones that he pulled out and said, "You see that? That's me. You see what Isaiah said? That one's me. You see what Zechariah said? That's me." All that's pointing here to me. I imagine it was an incredible sermon, to have all of those Old Testament dots connected for you, to see the big picture of the entire purpose of the Bible, that it all points to Jesus. And again, one of the questions I always have is, what passages did he go to? That's what I want to know. What was his text for his sermon? Undoubtedly, one of the texts that he used is our psalm for tonight, Psalm 16. We know that because the Apostle Peter uses Psalm 16 in his Pentecost sermon in Acts chapter 2. We know this because the Apostle Paul uses Psalm 16 in his sermon in the city of Antioch in Acts chapter 13. Both of them use it the same way. They use it to prove the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So if Jesus is going to point to these Old Testament scriptures that let us see who he is and what he came to do, Psalm 16 is absolutely going to be on that list because it proves that the Old Testament pointed to his resurrection from the dead. Not just his crucifixion. A lot of them do that. Psalm 22, Isaiah 53. But this one points in particular to the resurrection from the dead. So let's go to Psalm 16, and we'll spend the rest of our time together in these 11 verses. Psalm 16, starting in verse 1. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, and because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. It's a great psalm. Verses 9 and 10 are the ones that are used in the sermons of the book of Acts to prove the resurrection. Now, the background of Psalm 16 is debated. When did this psalm take place in King David's life? David has written this. At what point? Many of the psalms before this, we can pinpoint. This is what's going on in David's life, and it really brings to life what he said. You can't do that here. Some would say that it's obviously during some sort of challenging season in his life. He prays, God preserve me. So you would maybe only pray that if you're in danger. He talks about death cannot hold him, therefore death is imminent for him. So maybe he's on the run from King Saul out in the wilderness, or maybe he's been ousted by his son Absalom from the throne. As many other psalms, that's their backdrop. And they take the entire background being one of danger, one of impending death, since David prays this, and he mentions death in verse 10. I don't think that's necessarily the backdrop here. David's words seem to lack the desperation of impending death. Some of his other psalms certainly contain this background of imminent doom, and you can almost hear it in his voice. You can see that desperation coming out. That doesn't seem to be here in 16. Honestly, I think he's just musing about the realities of life, which include death, and he sees God's grace in all of it. This psalm seems to be a simple declaration that describes what a faithful servant of the Lord looks like and how faithful the Lord of that servant truly is. So it's basically about the faithfulness that David shows as God's servant and the faithfulness that God shows to his servant David. So we're just going to break it down into those two very broad categories, and it breaks down pretty much in half. So let's talk first and foremost about the faithful servant. What does the faithful servant of God do? How do they live their life? Well, that's the first 6 verses. Now, beginning in verse 1, David lays out this simple request to God. He then proceeds to describe how he's been faithful to God, not in this arrogant manner like he's bragging, not that at all. In this very humble, straightforward manner where he is expressing his undying devotion to his very gracious God. And that has a few pieces to it, and you see that breakdown in your notes. First, he will confess faith. In verses 1 and 2, he confesses faith. Again, he starts with this simple prayer. Preserve me, for in you I take refuge. It literally translates, keep watch over me. That's what preserve is keep watch over me. Keep looking, pay attention to what's happening in my life. Back in Psalm 11, he says, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark the upright in heart. In the Lord I take refuge. I'm not flying away like a bird. I'm flying to him. Now, that doesn't necessarily refer to danger. That doesn't necessarily mean he's fighting for his life or people are trying to kill him right now. It could be an overarching prayer to God. God, would you continue your watchful care in my life? As you pray prayers like that, that doesn't mean someone's trying to kill you, right? I mean, if so, 911 is your friend. Just because you're asking God to preserve you and take care of you doesn't mean you're in any imminent danger. So I think that might be reading a bit too much into the text. In fact, one of the commentators that I read, I really appreciated his take on this. He thinks that Psalm 16 was written by David right after the events of 2 Samuel 7. In 2 Samuel 7, you have the Davidic covenant. So like Genesis 12, when God makes a covenant with Abraham, in 2 Samuel 7, he makes one with David. And that's where he promises David, your kingly line will be on the throne for eternity. It's a passage not just about David's faithfulness and what God will do there, but in Jesus, David's descendant. Your descendant will reign over God's people forever. That now in response to that, David is praying, God, continue to watch over me. If that's what you're going to be doing in my life and beyond for generations to come, then God, I want you to watch over me. Plus, if you were to dig into 2 Samuel 7, after God gives this covenant to David, David responds to God in a very lengthy, rich, flavorful prayer. And in it, he uses some of the same language. In it, he uses a lot of the same concepts of submission to God and God being this great God who cares for him. So it could be that that's what's happening in the background. So this isn't in response to danger or death. This is in response to God's goodness and God's promises to him, which I think fit with the general, very positive attitude in the entire psalm. He says, for in you I take refuge. God's his hiding place. Now, this isn't David being cowardly, as if he's unwilling to face some sort of danger. David is not a coward. And if you read through David's life, David is absolutely not a coward. David fought lions and bears as a kid, as a shepherd boy out in the field. David, as a teenager, fought Goliath. He's not a coward. He makes these really challenging decisions as a king on the throne, fights multiple military campaigns. He's anything but weak. So he's simply acknowledging, God, my safety and my security is found in you. You are my refuge. That at any moment, anything could take me out, and the only reason I'm still alive is because you're my refuge. You have kept me safe in the midst of all of this. God, you've brought about my victories. So David's not taking credit for any of the success of his life. He sees that behind all of it is a very good and gracious God who loves him and cares for him. When he says take refuge, that verb is typically used in the Bible to refer to a bird finding shelter, someone finding shelter in a cave, or even someone hiding behind a shield. So they're taking refuge there. So David finds his comfort, he finds his protection in prayer. God, this is what protects me. This is what shields me. Is I am developing a relationship with you, and you now are the one that is my shield. You're the one keeping me safe. He goes on in verse 2, I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. This is his personal confession of faith. No one could ever doubt that David is answering to God. No one could ever question who David answers to. No one could ever question who David worships. He clearly confesses, God, you are the foundation of my faith. You are my Lord. In your notes, I put down Romans 10, 9 and 10. Let me encourage you to look that up. These are some of those most famous verses about salvation. This is where Paul tells them, if you believe in your heart, if you confess Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Because part of what it means to be saved by Jesus is we confess him as Lord. We do what David did in Psalm 16. We lay out, you're it for me. There is no other master. You are the one that I answer to. You are the one that I worship. There's total reliance upon him. Then I love this last phrase of verse 2, I have no good apart from you. So not only does David acknowledge, you are the one that I answer to, he acknowledges you're the source of everything good in my life. All the good stuff that I look around, all these blessings that I see, it's all from you, which we know is true. The Bible affirms, James 1:17, every good gift comes from above. So as we survey life, all that we look around and we say, this is good in my life, it came from him. Because he is the source of all the good. The phrase, I have no good apart from you, literally translates, my good does not exceed you. You are the one who brings all of it. So there is no good in my life, there is no good around my life that doesn't find its source in you. So he's totally dependent on God in this prayer. He's totally infatuated with God, with this good and gracious God. His security, his satisfaction is found in God alone. Secondly, as he lays out what his faithfulness looks like, he will express loyalty. He confesses his faith, he expresses loyalty. His loyalties are clear. And not only are they with God, he's already established that, you are my Lord, they're with God's people. That's who he is loyal to. So one of the ways, I would argue, a primary way that we show tangible love to God is by showing tangible love to his people. Now, if you want to make me an enemy in an instant, mistreat my kids. Hell hath no fury like a parent protecting their child. I will murder your face. Speak bad about my kids, be rude to my kids, harm them in some way, and you will have in me an enemy for life. Because parents have this natural parental instinct to come and protect their kids. God is your father. He has a natural instinct. It is a divine instinct to protect his kids, to help them, to care for them. This is why the New Testament overwhelmingly continues to teach us about relational holiness, as it teaches against things like gossip and slander and backbiting and fighting, and pushes us towards continual unity. Why? Because God doesn't want you to mistreat his kids. So we don't talk down to, we don't mistreat, we don't harm God's people, because you don't want to mess with dad when you mistreat God's people. So he lays out here, verse 3, as for the saints in the land, the Hebrew Hasidim, it literally translates holy ones. The holy ones in the land. He'll use it again in verse 10 when he says, you won't let your Holy One see corruption. So this is who God's people are. The New Testament borrows that same concept and calls Christians saints, literally translating holy ones, because the people of God are defined by the fact that they are the holy ones. They are the ones who are set apart from the world. The word here for excellent, he says they're the excellent ones. The word excellent is noble. They're the noble ones in the land. He uses the same word in Psalm 8:1 for God's majesty. God's people are the majestic ones in the world. They are the excellent ones in the world. And part of faithfulness to God is showing love to those who love him. We care for all of God's people as much as we can. But not only, as he lays out in verses 3 and 4, not only do we associate with holy people, we disassociate with unholy people. That's verse 4. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. When they say, run after another god, it literally translates those who pay a price for another god. Because when you remove yourself from the one true God and from the Christian faith, that's basically what you're doing when you're worshiping other gods. You're paying for them. You're paying with some sort of sacrifice. You're paying with your life. You're paying with your obedience. You're paying with your money. You're paying with something to get that God's attention, to get that God's affection. You are earning that God's attention in some way, shape, or form. And those who do that, he says, their sorrows are multiplied. It's the same phrase that God uses in Genesis 3:16 to describe part of the consequence of the fall. It's what he says to Eve. Your sorrows will increase because of the sin that you've brought into the world. This is what happens when you dishonor God and go a direction away from him. Your sorrows increase, and if you want the attention of some sort of false god, you're going to have to buy it. You're going to have to earn it. And what a terrible way to live. So when he says sorrow, the word for sorrow is a very general word. It could refer to physical issues, it could refer to emotional issues, it could refer to anxiety. That these are these just general life sorrows that you have to deal with in dealing with these false gods, because no matter what you do, it is never enough. No matter what price you pay, it's never enough. You will always have to pay more. So turn over to Ephesians chapter 2. This is one of those texts that I think deals with this issue. Ephesians 2 is this great gospel passage that lays out the good news for us. But before it lays out the good news, it lays out the bad news. Because you have to have that distinction, right? We've talked about this before. You can't have good news unless there's bad news, because it's good in that it's contrasted with the bad. Otherwise, it's just news. So in contrast to bad news, there is good news. So Ephesians 2, starting in verse 1, tells us the bad news. And you were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, referring to Satan, the spirit who's now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. That's really dark, bad news. Because of your sin, what you got from that is death. You're separated from God. Your soul is dead. You have no spiritual life in you, and you are a child of wrath. That's what naturally you will get, is wrath because of your sin. That's dark, bad news. So let's say that in Ephesians 2:4, instead of saying what he said, Paul wrote this. You're dead in your trespasses and sins. It's really bad for you. Children of wrath, yada, yada, yada. Burn in hell. Lay it all out. But verse 4, but God has decided that you can make it up to him. Now, we would immediately think, well, maybe that's a bit of good news. That, okay, I can do stuff. I could be moral. I can make up for lost ground that, as we talked about Sunday, I've got this red in the ledger. Well, if I can start making some deposits, Eventually, it's going to shrink that red, right? Wrong. That's not actually how it works. Because that wouldn't be good news. That would be worse news than the bad news. And here's why it's worse news. If you genuinely believe that you can make it up to God for all that you've done, what's the rest of your life going to look like? It's slavery. It's this overwhelming burden of trying to earn, of looking back over your life and trying to take an accurate accounting of all the sins you've committed. Good luck with that. I mean, even if you wrote down all the ones that you know about, what about all the ones you don't? The good that you could have done but didn't, that James calls sin, which we'll look at that verse later. How could you ever know? Sinful motivations, even when you do good things. How could you remember now when I did that, my motivation was terrible, so I'm going to write that one down. You would just have to try to cover yourself, assume every breath you ever took was a sinful breath. Every word you ever said was a sinful word. It's the only way to even try to get close to accurate. And then you're starting to try to make it up. Well, here's the problem. If you say, all right, it's going to be 10, 20, 30 years before I die, so I've got some time, all right, but every day that you go, what do you still do? You still sin. So you're still adding to the debit side even as you're trying to add to the credit side. So really, if there's this gap between you and God, the best that's going to happen is it's just going to go like this throughout your entire life. It's never going to get any closer. And even if it was, how would you ever know? Would you ever find comfort? Would you ever find assurance of your salvation? Absolutely not. Every day for the rest of your life, you would have anxiety about your eternal destination because you could never possibly know if you're actually saved or not. You could never know if you've done enough, and the only way you're going to find out is the day that you die and you stand before him and he tells you you did it or you didn't. What a horrible way to live. How awful that is. That's the worst news. There's no way we could even think about doing something like that. If you ever get a chance to go with us to India and do a missions trip, India's not really the place to travel right now on the world stage, but if you ever get the chance to go, it's a fascinating place. It's dark, but it's fascinating. Hinduism's dominant religion. They believe in 330 million gods. Not one, 330 million. That's a lot, in case you didn't know that. That's a lot of gods that all have names. They all have backstories. They all have pictures. You know what they look like. And they all have temples. They all have means of how to worship them. 330 million of them. So as you walk through major cities, you fly in and you are there in the midst of all the nasty nature of everything, and cows are everywhere. It's just a very weird sort of place. As you walk, you will see people doing a specific movement with their body all the time. So when you're there, the respectful greeting is namaste. That's what you do. Namaste. But you can shorthand it, and you can just go namaste. You don't have to do both hands. That's too much work. But you can just do the one. So you kind of nod namaste, and it's all good. It's very polite. Well, that's also a means of showing respect and honor to a god. So as all of these people, millions and millions of them, walk down the street, when they pass by all of these temples, what do you think they do? They have to stop and show honor to that god, because if they miss one, that god's going to condemn them. If they miss one, they've upset that god, and if they upset the god of water, they're not going to have any water, and it's going to stop raining. If they upset the god of food, then their family's going to starve. That's what they legitimately believe. So what a horrific way to live, that I'm surrounded by a almost unlimited number of false pagan deities, that if I don't honor them as I walk by their buildings, they're going to punish me and my kids. That's this. That those who walk through life running after another god, their sorrows multiply. And that's what their sorrows look like. It's never-ending anxiety and into an eternity apart from God. But thankfully, that's not what Ephesians 2:4 says. But God, who is rich in mercy, made you alive with Christ. How incredible is that? Isn't that way better? That you have this debt you can't pay, and he paid it because he's rich in mercy. It's settled. You are in by trust in Jesus Christ. You're good. That's a way better way to live. And David continues, the back half of verse 4. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out. He say, I will not participate in their pagan worship rituals. I won't go to their temples. I won't do these things. But notice what he says next. I will not take their names on my lips. He won't even say the names of these pagan gods. And here's why. Baal, one of the more famous pagan gods throughout the Old Testament, his name literally translates Lord. Molech, one of the more popular gods, also one of the darker pagan gods, they would sacrifice their children to Molech. Molech had a big statue with his arms out that they would, bronze, and they would heat it up to burning, and they would place their children in his heated up arms and would sacrifice their children to Molech. He was the Canaanite god. His name translates as king. So to even say their names in David's mind bestows on them a title they don't deserve. He's not Lord. I'm not even going to say his name. He's not king. I'm not even going to say his name. But notice whose name is on David's lips. Go back to verse 1. Preserve me, O God. El. Elohim is the plural version of El. The strong one is a word for the name for God and his strength. Verse 2, I say to the Lord, it's in all caps, Yahweh, God's covenant name. This is how you'll know me. This is my personal name. And what does he say to him? I say to Yahweh, you are my Lord. Adonai, Master. So I don't call these other gods Lord. I call you Lord. So only the one true God, only his name is on David's lips. So notice the clear delineation of relationships in David's life. He associates, he loves, he delights in those who love God. And he refuses to associate with false gods and those who love false gods. He doesn't even want to be a part of what they're doing. This goes back, we talked about this last week in Psalm 15, verse 4. In whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. He loves those who love God and rejects those who don't. Third aspect of David's faithfulness here is he will profess praise. 5 and 6 in the beginning of verse 7. Because after what he says here in verse 5 and verse 6, he can't help but to spontaneously praise God at the beginning of verse 7. I bless the Lord. I honor him. I worship him. He can't help it. So let's see why. Verse 5. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. Now, portion is the word for inheritance. So his chosen portion, his chosen inheritance is God. You are my portion. The language he uses here, and he uses it in verse 6 as well, about the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. That is the language of dividing up the land once the Israelites conquered the promised land. So once under Joshua, the Israelites go in, they cross the river, and they go into the land of Canaan, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, and they slowly drive out the Canaanites and all the different battles in the book of Joshua. That's what's happening. They're driving them out. And you get towards the end of the book of Joshua, and they lay out, this is who gets what land. So here's the promised land God has said is ours since Genesis 12 to Abraham. So here it is. So we're going to divide up the land between the 12 tribes of Israel. So this tribe gets this section, this tribe gets this section. It's the same language used here. That land was their inheritance for that tribe, for those families. That land is to take care of them, to meet their needs in this life and in the generations to come. So what is David saying? God, that's what you are for me. I don't need land to take care of me. You take care of me. And not just in my life, you will do so for generations to come. And interestingly enough, all of the 12 tribes of Israel got an allotment of land except for one. The Levites were not given an allotment of land. Started with Aaron, the brother of Moses, the first high priest. They were not given land, and you have Numbers 18:20 listed there. That's where God tells Aaron, you are not getting an allotment of land because I am your portion and I am your inheritance. So don't look to land for inheritance, you look to me, because you, as my priests, you don't live off the land, you live off of me. I'm the one who gives all of this to you. So David's simply acknowledging God is the one who provides. He's the one who gives me everything I will ever need. He's my chosen portion, and secondly, he's my cup. Well, cup tends to refer to destiny, what's happening later. So the wicked drink the cup of judgment all throughout the entire Old Testament. The righteous drink the cup of blessing. Psalm 23, verse 5, my cup overflows. God's been so good to me. The blessings of my life overflows. It's the same language. So God is his provision and God is his destiny. God's where I'm headed. And he says this little phrase, you hold my lot. Again, it's the language of the allotment of the land. You hold it. You are in charge of this. So whatever's going to happen to David, whatever's going to take place in his life, God holds that cup, because God controls that inheritance. Verse 6, the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Like surveying the land, it's good. The more David surveys of God, the more amazed he is, the more grateful he is. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. This is good. I don't need land. I have God. I don't need this. I have God. And then he ends by repeating the idea, indeed I have a beautiful inheritance. And what is his inheritance? It's God himself. God is my beautiful inheritance. He is my portion. In life and afterlife, you get God. That's the whole point. Notice how affectionately he speaks about God. There is no hint of a loss of manliness here on David's part. David's a man's man, certainly the case, but he speaks with a love language of his God. Pleasant places. He calls him beautiful. David's not after money. He's not after a bigger palace. He's not after power. He is genuinely after more of God. One of the scholars that I read asked, with these verses, asked some very convicting questions that I really didn't like and wish he wouldn't have asked them. But here he went some specific directions, but they were summed up like this. And let me just pass them on to you and see if you feel the same conviction I did. If God promised you today, and his word is his bond. God's promises always come true. If God promised you today unimaginable wealth, guaranteed success, and personal happiness in your life and family, but a relationship with him was not included in that, would you want it? Would you say, sure, that sounds great, because this is what I'm after in life? He then went on and he asked this, if God promised you heaven, guaranteed spot, you get to go, here's your ticket, there it is, and all that comes with heaven, you get the golden streets, you get the crystal sea, you get it all, but he wouldn't be there, would you still want to go? And my first reaction reading those was, of course I wouldn't want to go. How stupid. But then you think about it. A life of guaranteed success and happiness and money, no worries, all this stuff that we all chase after. You just don't have a relationship with God, but you have everything that you've wanted. Don't be so fast to say, of course I don't want that. Because this is the American dream, right here. This is it. And don't be so quick to deny, I get heaven, I get this guaranteed eternal place of bliss and happiness and everything that I've hoped for. It's just that God's not going to be there, but everything else is. All the other people who have died before me that I'm looking forward to being reunited with, all of that, it's just that I won't see God there, but I get all of that just without him. Don't be so quick to say, oh, of course I wouldn't go. Of course you want to go. We would all naturally say, well, yeah, why would I turn that down? Which I think, I know it did in me, exposed this. Do you really believe that God is better than those things? To the point where you wouldn't want to go unless he was there. And those are convicting questions that it would do us well to ask. How much do I value these good things in life and even in eternity versus the presence of God in my life? Because when you hear people talk about heaven, what do they typically talk about? They don't typically talk about, I'm gonna see the Lord, he's there on his throne, and I'm there with Jesus. What do they talk about? I'm gonna see so-and-so who's already died. I can't wait to see him. I'm gonna be there. I'm gonna play the golf course in the sky or whatever. Now, I don't know if I don't think there's a golf course in heaven, and if there is, it better not have sand traps, because it's supposed to be enjoyable. Is it a sin if you throw a golf club after a bad shot in heaven? I don't know. I don't know how that works. But don't be so quick to immediately dismiss as if, well, I'm so holy that I wouldn't want those things without him, because I'm not sure it's true of us as much as we want it to be true. We need to wrestle with that. Paul dealt with this. Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, to live as Christ, to die as gain. It's better for me to die. He says later, it's better by far. It's the only triple comparative in the entire Bible. The only place that God puts 3 exclamation points is on dying and going to be with him. It's gain. It's better. Philippians 3:8. All these good things that Paul lists about his life, I set it all aside. I consider it rubbish that I might gain Christ. He's better than all of these other things. That's tough to get our heads around. So that's the faithful servant. The faithful servant does those things as David lays them out. And really, the next section, the rest of verse 7 all the way through verse 11, tells us why that is. Yes, there's this servant's role before God. It's what faithfulness looks like. But now let's talk about motivation. Why be faithful to the Lord? Because the Lord is so very faithful to his people. Because as we walk through this description of what God gives, why would we not want to be faithful? And David here simply sets God's goodness at the forefront. I mean, he laid it out at the end of verse 2, I have no good apart from you. And now he's describing what that goodness actually looks like. Because when you keep God's goodness in the forefront of your mind, it helps us maintain that motivation we need to continue to be faithful to him. No matter what happens, keep his goodness at the forefront. Over the last almost 21 years now, I've done a lot of funerals. I've done a lot of weddings, and I've done a lot of funerals. It's occupational hazard. Those things are included in the role. And sometime if we're having a personal conversation, I'd be happy to tell you about some of the funeral stories. I've got some wild funeral stories because I've been a part of a lot of different ones. Murders. I did a funeral years ago with news cameras in the back for a 16-year-old girl that had been killed by a police officer. Talk about nerve-wracking. To how do you talk about this, which it was a justifiable shooting. How do you talk about this in a way that comforts a family of a girl who did something really stupid that got her killed? How do you do that without crossing some sort of line, and where are those lines even? The most, as you can imagine, the most sobering, difficult funerals to do are the ones for children. They're very difficult, incredibly challenging. And I've done funerals for kids that were the same ages as my kids at the same time. So, really, really challenging to do that. One of them was for a baby that had not survived. And I'd been with the family in the excitement of leading up to the birth and all the hope that soon-to-be parents have. And then for a baby to not make it, and then you're there with them. You go from one day from the highs of highs to the lows of lows with the same two people. And to do this funeral, and Dad carrying a casket that looks like a glorified shoebox. It's a tiny little, they shouldn't make caskets that small. What do you say at that funeral? There are no words that can help. Here's where I went. There are two things you need to be reminded about who God is. God is both sovereign and good. That's what you need to know. He is sovereign. He's in control of everything. He's in charge. This didn't surprise him. He isn't up in heaven trying to figure out what went wrong. And he's good. He loves you. He cares for you. And he has nothing but your best in mind. And it's the same with your child who's now with him. Now, if God is sovereign and not good, he's a brutal dictator. If God is good but not sovereign, he's a senile grandpa who pats you on your head but can't get anything done. He's both. He's sovereign and he is good, because if you don't keep God's promised goodness in front of you, you will fall apart when your life falls apart. You will explode in dangerous times, in dark times. Because if you forget that he's good, you don't see the work that he's doing in your life. You have to keep his goodness at the forefront. And that is what David is doing. No matter what's happening, here's how good and gracious God is. And these verses also lay out, it's not just that we enjoy God, because that's again, verses 5 and 6. You're my inheritance. I get more of God. This is all that I'm after. The rest of these verses give us the freedom to enjoy the gifts that God gives to us as well. That it's not just enjoy God and reject everything else in your life. You get to enjoy his gifts. So, say Christmas time comes around and you buy a very expensive, very nice gift for your kid, grandkid, whoever it might be, and you're so excited to give it to them because they've been asking for this. You know they want it, and they're just going to explode in excitement in their little jammy jams on Christmas morning, and it's going to be so fun, and they're going to play with it, and you get to watch their face of delight play with this gift. And then they open it, and they go, oh, thank you, it's very kind of you, so gracious, I'm so appreciative. And then they set it aside, and they come and they sit next to you, and they put their arms around you, and they go, but really, you're the best gift of all. First of all, that's never going to happen. So we're obviously making that up. 2, how much in that moment do you appreciate that reaction? There might be a moment of, oh, that's sweet. But that fades quickly. Why? Because I got you this because you wanted this, and I am delighted to watch you enjoy it and play with it. It is no different for God. God gives us himself. He's the best gift, yes. But God gives tremendous gifts because he's a kind and loving Father. And he delights in watching you enjoy the gifts that he gives to you. His gifts to you are an extension of his love for you. So there's nothing wrong with enjoying all the goodness of God in your life, all the great things that he's graciously given to you. We don't reject those. We don't feel bad for those. We enjoy them because they're from a good God who loves us well. And David now lays out a few of them. The first one he lays out is guidance. God gives me guidance. Verse 7, I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. So God doesn't leave you alone to figure things out on your own. He graciously, kindly gives you counsel. David says, my heart instructs me. Now, the word for instruct is a word for chasten or discipline. My heart disciplines me. Now, by heart, it literally translates kidneys, but it's referring to the innards. He's referring to a biblically informed conscience. My heart speaks to me. My conscience is disciplining me, is helping me, guiding me. And because if you have those moments where in the night you're laying there, again, people are never more honest with themselves, and those minutes laying down, head on pillow, but before they fall asleep. That's when so much comes crashing in. That's when the heart begins to speak. And if you are caught up in some sin, it should rightly be bothering you. There should rightly be some guilt and motivation to do better. That's a good thing. That's a helpful thing. That's God informing your heart, this is wrong, this is sinful. It corrects us. So God is graciously, kindly, he directs us and he disciplines us. He counsels us and he corrects us. He does all of this. And how does he do this? Well, the key here is found in the phrase, in the night. In the night also my heart instructs me. It's literally nights, it's plural. So during the nights my heart instructs me. So does this mean that while you and I are asleep, maybe if we sleep with a Bible underneath our pillow through some sort of osmosis process, we'll gather. Maybe you've seen that video of I think it's a Chinese child. He's in school and he's got his textbook open and he just goes. He's trying to pull the knowledge off the page and float it into his head. It doesn't really work that way, unfortunately, but it would be really nice if it did. So how is this happening in the nights? How are we being corrected and counseled by God? Well, from the rest of the Psalms, one of the things we discover about David is David's nightly habit was to pray and meditate on Scripture. So that's what he's talking about. In the nights, I'm being instructed. I'm being counseled. How? Because that's when I pray and read the Bible. I spend time with God and His Word. This is how He counsels. This is how He corrects. This is how He directs. This is how He disciplines, by continual meditation on His Word. The second gift He gives to us is stability. Verse 8. He says, I set the Lord before me. Meaning my thoughts and my perspectives are focused on God. He's ever mindful of God. So God's will, God's commands, God's perspectives, they're His priority. And to fail to do this is what gets you in trouble, because what God says, how God would feel about something, that's what matters most. And notice he says, I set the Lord before me, and because the Lord is at my right hand. Not because God is some assistant director in his life. He's in the co-pilot seat or he's in the assistant seat. The right hand is the position of honor and power. When he says God is at my right hand, what he means is God is honored more than anyone else in my life. God's strength is more abundant than anything else in my life. And he says, because I set God before me, I'm focused on him and his ways, because I honor him and I'm trusting in his strength, therefore, the end of verse 8, I shall not be shaken. I won't budge. No matter what happens in life, no matter the ups and the downs, I will not be moved. He's firm, he's secure. In his relationship with God, in his role as king, he will not be moved. The end of Psalm 15, the very last sentence of verse 5, he who does these things shall never be moved. Again, you can live in such a way and be in such a relationship with God that no matter what happens in life around you, you don't budge. It's a way better way to live. 3, resurrection. He promises resurrection. So verse 9, therefore my heart is glad. My whole being rejoices. So his entire life is lived in praise to God for his faithfulness. So when he says here, my whole being rejoices, it's a word for liver. So beforehand, his kidneys are instructing him at night. Now his liver is worshiping. What in the world is going on? Well, in the Bible, your internal organs are related to your feelings. The word for compassion is bowels. because you're feeling it in your gut. It's your innards. It's who you are. Again, they don't have this intimate knowledge of what's all happening with all the different things in your body. So it's just your inside, who you are. And that's what he's saying. Who I am is fully in worship of God. But notice how he ends verse 9. My flesh also dwells secure. So not only is he really secure in the other areas of his life, his relationship with God, he's secure in his role as king. I mean, he's got the utmost of confidence in God. You can see that all throughout Psalm 16. Apparently, he's also very confident physically. My flesh dwells secure. No one's going to take me out. There's not an enemy army that's going to take me out. There's not some errant arrow flying my way that's going to take me out. No one's going to push me off my throne and take my life. Well, how could that be? Now, if David is really facing here some sort of imminent danger, how could he ever say that? How could you ever know that, nope, I got this. Nobody's going to take me out. You can't know if you're going to live or die. God knows, but you don't know that. So if he's laying out this sort of, bragging, overconfident, manly, nobody going to kill me, that really doesn't fit with David. It really doesn't fit with the scriptures. So what is he doing here? He's expressing this confidence about this physical safety that he feels, but that has to be taken in context of what he says in the next verse. Verse 10, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. So here's what he's saying. Listen, I am secure physically, and even if somebody kills me, I am still secure. So because of that, I'm physically secure. They could take out my life. It doesn't affect anything whatsoever. They can kill me today, but my relationship with God doesn't change. He's not worried at all about his death. Not even close. Verse 10, if he doesn't live, even if he dies, he knows God will not abandon him. He will not forsake him. So he's physically secure precisely because he is thoroughly unconcerned about his upcoming death. And when you are not concerned about your upcoming death, you are very secure. Because the biggest thing that could come after you doesn't scare you anymore. There's tremendous freedom to be found in that. He says, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. Sheol is the place of the dead. It's the grave. Not necessarily a physical place. Doesn't necessarily have to refer to somewhere like hell. It's just where the dead go. Sheol. So here's his point as he kind of culminates here. If God is all of this for me, as he's laid out all of this in Psalm 16, he's so gracious, he's so kind, he's so loving, he's so merciful, he's my chosen portion, he's my cup, beautiful inheritance, he does all these things for me. If all that is true, then I know that God will not abandon me at the moment of my greatest need. He's never abandoned me before. He's not going to start by abandoning me at my death. He is completely confident that his relationship with this very kind and very gracious God isn't going to end when he dies. It's just going to continue into eternity. What confidence? He says, your Holy One will not see corruption. Now, there are some disagreements on how that should be translated. Some say that's referring to decay. That's what corruption means. You won't let your Holy One see decay. Others see it just as a metaphor for death. In fact, the word corruption, if you're using the ESV, it's got a footnote. It can be translated as pit, which is probably a better translation because that's what the word means. I think it's a parallel to Sheol, the place of the dead. You won't abandon me to the place of the dead, and you're not going to leave me in the pit. You won't leave me in the grave. That's the whole point of what he's saying here. And again, verse 10 in particular is what the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul use in the book of Acts to prove the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And they both use it the same way. They both interpret it the same way, that as David says this, all right, you won't abandon my soul to the grave. You won't let your Holy One see corruption or decay. Both Peter and Paul say in their sermons that can't be completely true about David. Why? Because in Jerusalem is David's crypt, where he's been for 1,000 years. He's decayed. He's seen corruption. He's still in the grave. Now, we know that David is meaning from this spiritual perspective, that God's not going to abandon me. I'm going to be with God in eternity. But they turn and look at this and say, David isn't speaking only of himself. David is speaking of another one who will not be abandoned in the grave, who will be resurrected from the dead before his body could even decay. And he will be risen victoriously from the dead, because this promise is ultimately about Jesus. Love that. And it's a promise that's not just about David, but also about Jesus. It's a promise that's not just about Jesus and also about you. That by trust in him, those verses are yours. He will not abandon your soul in the place of death. He will not leave you in the grave. He promises to resurrect all who trust in him. As he raised Jesus, he raises you. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we're to be pitied more than all men. Because our hope is not just until the day we die. Because Psalm 16:10 is true, our hope goes into eternity. Because he doesn't leave us in the place of death. Last benefit here he gives to us is eternity. In verse 11, you make known to me the path of life. Even in death, the Lord shows us the path to life. He's the one who continues our living. Jesus said in John 11:25, he that believes in me will live even though he dies. Yeah, physically you're going to go out, but eternally you're with me. But this doesn't even have to refer only to eternal life. Following Jesus is the way to life. To walk in his ways is to truly live. Jesus said in John 10:10, I came to give you life, and life to the full, life abundant. And that's what David says next. In your presence there is fullness of joy. So not only is God the source of all that is good, God is the source of joy. This is why Christians who are sour and cranky all the time are really missing something critical in their faith. He brings joy. In your presence there is fullness of joy. You're in his presence right now. Therefore, our lives are to be marked by a fullness of joy. How wonderful that is. And look at this last phrase, at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Eternal joy, eternal satisfaction. So David said earlier in verse 6 that his allotment in life, his eternity with God, fell in pleasant places. Now he says God provides pleasures. It's the same root word, pleasure, pleasant. Things that please. This is what God gives. Things that please. God isn't a killjoy. God isn't after you being miserable all the time. God is after your delight in life. Joyous. All of it comes from God. And notice where these pleasures are found. At your right hand. So in verse 8, David keeps God at his right hand. And now, where is David? He's at God's right hand. This is what happens when you place God at your right hand, in the place of honor in your life, the place of strength in your life. Those who place God at their right hand are those who find themselves in eternity at God's right hand. Because those are the ones who get in to be with him forever. Let me end by telling you a story about one of the more, maybe one of the less known figures from church history that I think exemplifies Psalm 16. His name is Polycarp. Have you heard of Polycarp before? He's not a fish. Polycarp was the bishop in the city of Smyrna. Bishop was chief elder, so he's the chairman of the elders at the church in Smyrna. He's the pastor there. Smyrna was a city in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. It's one of the cities that in Revelation 2 and 3, when Jesus sends the letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, Smyrna is the second one after Ephesus. In fact, I think it might be helpful to even read that letter. So Revelation 2, it's a short one. Starting in verse 8, here's what Jesus says to this church in the city of Smyrna. "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they're Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." It's the only church of the 7 that Jesus addresses that he doesn't condemn them for anything. It's all positive. There's persecution coming their way. They're going to go to prison. He's going to kill them. Be faithful even unto death. Well, about 25 years after Jesus sent that letter through the Apostle John, Polycarp becomes the pastor of that very church. And Smyrna followed through on persecuting the Christians. And not too long before they came after Polycarp, they had already arrested and assassinated multiple of the Christians in the city. And they now come after the pastor of the church. If we can take him down, maybe we can take down the whole church. He was warned ahead of time, your arrest is coming. And at this point, an arrest equals you're being killed in the arena. So he left the city and he hid in a farmhouse. The threat was very real. He knew it. So he's hiding, waiting to see what's going to happen. The city of Smyrna was fiercely loyal to Rome and to the empire. They worshipped the old Roman gods, and they worshipped the emperor himself. So the governor dispatched troops to track down Polycarp. Now, Polycarp had the distinction of being the last church leader alive in the world who had been discipled by one of Jesus' apostles. Polycarp was discipled by the apostle John himself. So, he's a big deal that he's personal friends with John, who by this point is dead. So John wrote Revelation in the 90s AD, and Polycarp dies in 155 AD, 60 years after Revelation is closed. So witnesses are tortured by the soldiers, trying to find out where Polycarp is hiding, and it's then revealed. The soldiers arrive to arrest him. He comes outside and he welcomes them as if they're old friends. And they come in, and he's very polite and kind to them. He asks for his host at the farmhouse to give them food and drink, and he asks for 1 hour because he knows where he's going. Give me 1 hour to pray. And they grant it. They eat and they drink, and Polycarp goes over, and he's within earshot, and he begins to pray, and they overhear his prayers. And by the historical accounts, they loved his prayers. They were so godly. They were so gracious. They were so filled with the greatness of his God. And they stretched that hour into 2. And they let him live a bit longer. But eventually they have to do what they're called to do. So they arrest him, and they near the city. And one of the pagan magistrates, one of the leaders of the city, rides up to him on a chariot and picks Polycarp up, and they begin to ride into town. And while they're riding in the chariot, he's trying to convince Polycarp, you need to offer sacrifices to the emperor. If you will burn incense to the emperor, declaring him to be God, then all this goes away. Immediately it goes away. He refuses, obviously, so the leader kicks him out of the chariot as it's moving. And he tears up his legs, and he's got blood running down his legs. So Polycarp limps the rest of his way to the arena, and as he enters, the arena is full. And the mob explodes in rage and their bloodlust. They are ready to kill him. The governor, in front of the entire crowd, asks him to deny Christ and says, if you do, we will spare your life. This all goes away. And Polycarp, in that moment, put on the spot in front of this huge crowd of people, his life is on the line, he responded with his now very famous statement. He said, and I quote, 86 years, so 86 years, have I served him, and he has never done me injury. How then could I now blaspheme my King and Savior? They continue to prompt him to deny Christ. He continues to reject. The governor threatens to burn him alive. Polycarp responds to that threat by preaching a little mini sermon on the fires of hell for the governor. This is boldness. This is courage. So he's ordered to be executed. The soldiers come up to him to prepare to nail him to the stake, and he tells them, nails will not be necessary because I will not be leaving. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to run away. You don't need to nail me. So they just tie him to the stake, and the fire's lit, and the flames increase around him. And according to the eyewitness accounts of that day, they said as the flames came up, they parted around his body as if the flames were unwilling to touch his body. And that his body glowed, and I quote, like gold in the fire. And finally, him not dying, glowing in front of the crowd who were trying to figure out why he's not being burned alive. On February the 23rd, in the year 155 AD, a soldier walked up to him with a sword and executed him in front of the crowd. This is a man who knew how to live. He is faithful to the Lord. No matter what happens, he devotes his life to serving God's people. You don't have to be paid to do that. He devotes his life to serving God's people, to loving the Lord, to knowing him better. And not only is this a man who knows how to live, this is a man who knows how to die. He is not afraid because he knows that Psalm 16:10 is true. You will not abandon my soul to Sheol. You will not let your Holy One see corruption. The Lord does not abandon his people in the moment of their greatest need. And that, my friends, is our hope. Let's pray. Father, thank you for Psalm 16. Thank you for the powerful message of David's incredible faithfulness. It's a faithfulness we want to model our own lives after, to be very clear as we confess our faith, as we express our loyalty to you, as we profess praise, when our lives to be marked by our praise of you. And all of those things are simply because you are so faithful to us. You are so loving. You're so merciful. You're so gracious. You are so kind to us when we don't deserve any of that, but you are so very gracious. You welcome us in. And not only do you give us yourself, you give us all this stuff. You give us all these incredibly wonderful gifts in life. So help us to identify those and to be grateful for them and to see them as coming from your hand and not get caught up in the chasing after of the gifts that you give, but knowing ultimately and eternally our inheritance is beautiful because it's you. At the end of the day, what we long for the most, what we look forward to the most, what we care about the most is you. More of you in our life now and all of you in eternity. Thank you for the hope of that reality that faces us. So may we, in response to your faithfulness to us, may we continue to be faithful to you. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Love you. See you Sunday.